The dust swirled like ghosts around her bloodied, cracked feet as Victoria Ziegler stumbled into the outskirts of Broken Ridge, Colorado, her black mourning dress torn and dirty, her face hollow with grief and hunger, but her eyes burning with a fierce determination that belied her fragile appearance. It was the summer of 1875, and she had walked nearly 30 miles since burying her husband 3 days prior, fleeing the farm that debt collectors would soon claim, carrying nothing but a small cloth bundle containing her wedding ring, a daguerreotype of her parents, and $5 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. The townsfolk of Broken Ridge stopped to stare as she made her way down the main street, some with pity in their eyes, others with suspicion. Victoria kept her gaze forward, dignity wrapped around her like armor despite her pitiful state. Her throat was parched, her stomach empty, but she would not beg, not yet. She had come too far, endured too much. "Madam," a deep voice called out, stopping her in her tracks. "Madam, you're bleeding." Victoria turned slowly, swaying slightly with exhaustion, to find herself looking up at a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and kind eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore a dusty brown hat that shaded his face and trail-worn clothes that spoke of long days in the saddle. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice cracking from disuse and thirst. The man, clearly a cowboy by his worn leather chaps and the way he carried himself, frowned and shook his head. "No, madam, you're not." He glanced down at her feet, where blood had left small prints in the dust of the street. Without hesitation, he guided her to a nearby bench outside the general store. "Name's Grant Irwin," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair streaked with gold from the sun. "I work at the Diamond Creek Ranch outside of town." He knelt before her, his expression troubled as he examined her feet. "These need tending." "Victoria," she replied softly. "Victoria Ziegler, widow as of last week." Understanding flickered in Grant's eyes, and without another word he began unlacing his own boots. Victoria watched in disbelief as he pulled them off, followed by his woolen socks. "What are you doing?" she asked, alarmed. "You need these more than I do," he said simply, placing the boots beside her. "They'll be too big, but the socks will help, and they're better than nothing." "I can't take your boots," Victoria protested, though the sight of them made her feet throb with longing. "How will you? I've got another pair at the ranch," Grant interrupted with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "And the general store's just there if I need something sooner." Before Victoria could argue further, the door of the general store swung open, and an older woman emerged, her gray hair pinned severely beneath a small hat. "What's all this, then?" she demanded, eyeing Victoria with suspicion. "Mrs. Abernathy," Grant said, standing and placing his hat back on his head. "This is Mrs. Ziegler. She's walked a fair distance and needs some assistance." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Walked from where, dear?" "Piney Creek," Victoria answered, naming the small settlement nearly 30 miles away. "Our farm, after my husband died." She couldn't continue. Mrs. Abernathy's demeanor changed instantly. "Good heavens, child, come inside this instant," she shot Grant an approving look. "Mr. Irwin, you're a good man, but this woman needs more than boots. She needs food, proper clothes, and a place to stay." Grant nodded. "I was about to suggest the boarding house." "Nonsense. Martha Simmons hasn't aired those rooms in months." Mrs. Abernathy turned to Victoria. "You'll stay with me tonight, at least until we figure something more permanent." Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes. "I can't pay much," she admitted. "We'll discuss that later," Mrs. Abernathy said firmly. "Now, put on those boots, Mr. Irwin has so generously offered, and let's get you inside." With trembling hands, Victoria pulled on the thick socks and boots. They were indeed too large, but after days of walking on bruised and bleeding feet, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. She stood shakily, testing her balance. Grant cleared his throat. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'll stop by tomorrow to check on Mrs. Ziegler if that's all right." The older woman smiled knowingly. "I'm sure Mrs. Ziegler would appreciate that," as Victoria followed Mrs. Abernathy into the store. She looked back at the cowboy who had given her his boots. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin." He touched the brim of his hat. "My pleasure, Mrs. Ziegler." That night, after a hot bath, a meal that brought tears to her eyes, and dressed in a borrowed nightgown, Victoria lay in a soft bed in Mrs. Abernathy's spare room. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of her husband Thomas, dead at 32 from pneumonia after a winter that had been too cold and a house that had been too drafty. She thought of the farm they'd struggled to maintain, the debts that had mounted, and the child they'd buried 3 years earlier. And then, strangely, she found herself thinking of the cowboy with the kind eyes who had given her his boots without hesitation. Sleep claimed her eventually, dreamless and deep, the first real rest she'd had in weeks. The next morning, Victoria awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Her body ached from the long journey, but her feet, though still sore, felt remarkably better. Mrs. Abernathy had treated them with a salve that smelled of herbs and beeswax, binding the worst cuts with clean bandages. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Abernathy greeted her as she entered the kitchen. "Feeling better, much," Victoria admitted, accepting a cup of coffee. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," the older woman replied, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "Now we should discuss your situation. Do you have any family you can go to?" Victoria shook her head. "My parents died years ago. Thomas was all I had." Mrs. Abernathy considered this. "What can you do? Any skills?" "I can cook, so keep accounts," Victoria said. "I helped run our farm. I can work hard, Mrs. Abernathy." "I believe you," the older woman said with a nod. "And please call me Harriet. As it happens, I could use help in the store. Nothing permanent yet, mind you, but enough to keep you fed and housed until something better comes along." Victoria's throat tightened with gratitude. "I would be most appreciative." "Good, that's settled then." Harriet sipped her coffee. "Now, what shall we do about your clothing situation? You can't keep wearing my old things, they're far too large for you." Before Victoria could respond, there was a knock at the door. Harriet's eyes twinkled as she rose to answer it. Grant Irwin stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. At his feet was a small trunk. "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy," he said politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Irwin. We were just having breakfast. Would you care to join us?" "Thank you, madam, but I've eaten." His eyes moved past Harriet to Victoria, who suddenly felt very conscious of her borrowed dress and loosely pinned hair. "Mrs. Ziegler, I hope you're feeling better today." "I am, thank you," she replied, curtsying slightly. "Your boots were a blessing." He smiled, and Victoria couldn't help noticing how it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners pleasantly. "I'm glad. I've brought something that might help further." He gestured to the trunk. "My sister Elizabeth left some clothes when she married and moved to Denver last year. She's about your size, I'd reckon. I thought they might serve until you can get settled." Harriet clapped her hands together. "How thoughtful! Bring it in, Mr. Irwin." As Grant carried the trunk inside, Victoria felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Mr. Irwin, this is too generous." "I couldn't possibly, please," he interrupted gently. "Lizzie would want them used, and they're just gathering dust at the ranch. Consider it a welcome to Broken Ridge." Victoria looked at the trunk, then back at Grant. "Thank you," she said simply. "You're most welcome." He replaced his hat. "I should get back to work. The ranch doesn't run itself." "Of course," Harriet said. "But perhaps you might escort Mrs. Ziegler to church on Sunday. She should meet more of the townsfolk. Victoria began to protest, but Grant was already nodding. "I'd be honored if Mrs. Ziegler is agreeable." Put on the spot, Victoria could only nod. "That would be lovely, thank you." After Grant left, Harriet helped Victoria open the trunk. Inside were several dresses, all simple but well made, along with petticoats, stockings, and even a bonnet. "That man," Harriet said thoughtfully, holding up a blue calico dress against Victoria, "has been looking for a wife for 2 years now." Victoria blushed. "Mrs. Abernathy, Harriet, I'm newly widowed. I'm not looking for a husband." "Of course not, dear," Harriet agreed, though her expression remained knowing. "But Grant Irwin is 30 years old, owns a share in one of the most prosperous ranches in the county, and has never shown this much interest in any woman in town. Just something to consider." Victoria didn't respond, but as she tried on Elizabeth Irwin's clothes, finding them a near-perfect fit, she couldn't help wondering about the man who had given her not just his boots, but his kindness when she needed it most. The next few days passed in a blur as Victoria began working in Harriet's store. The older woman taught her the inventory system, introduced her to regular customers, and allowed her to sleep in the small room above the store. By Saturday, Victoria's feet had healed enough that she could wear normal shoes again, though she kept Grant's boots cleaned and polished by her bed. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm. Victoria dressed in Elizabeth's blue calico, arranged her hair carefully, and pinned Thomas's wedding ring to the inside of her dress, close to her heart. Though she had agreed to attend church with Grant, she felt a stab of guilt at the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Grant arrived promptly at 10, wearing a clean black suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. He offered his arm, and Victoria took it, conscious of the curious glances from townsfolk as they walked to the small white church at the end of the main street. "People are staring," she whispered. "Let them," Grant replied easily. "They're just not used to seeing me with such a pretty companion." Victoria felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Irwin, you shouldn't say such things." "Why not? It's the truth." His gray eyes held hers for a moment. "And please call me Grant." The service passed in a blur. Victoria was introduced to what felt like the entire town, including Grant's employer, Samuel Thornton, owner of Diamond Creek Ranch, and his wife Eleanor. Victoria was touched by their genuine welcome, though she noticed several young women watching her with undisguised curiosity. After church, Grant suggested lunch at the hotel restaurant. "Unless you'd prefer to go back to Mrs. Abernathy's," he added. "Lunch sounds lovely," Victoria replied, surprising herself with her eagerness to spend more time with him. Over a simple meal of roast chicken and potatoes, Victoria found herself telling Grant about her life, her childhood in Pennsylvania, moving west with her parents, meeting Thomas when she was 18, their struggles on the farm, and finally, the devastating winter that had taken both her husband and their dreams. "I'm sorry," she said finally, embarrassed by how much she had shared. "You didn't ask to hear my life story." "I wanted to know," Grant assured her. "And I'm sorry for your losses, Victoria. No one should have to endure so much." "Life doesn't always give us what we want," she said softly. "But I'm grateful for the kindness I've found here." Grant hesitated, then reached across the table to briefly touch her hand. "I'd like to keep seeing you if you're amenable. I know it's soon after your loss, and I respect that, but I enjoy your company." Victoria looked at their hands, so close on the tablecloth. "I enjoy yours too," she admitted. "But yes, it is soon. I need time." "Time you shall have," Grant promised. "Friends for now," Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. Friends. As summer turned to fall, Victoria settled into life in Broken Ridge. Her position at Harriet's store became permanent, and she moved into a small cottage behind the store that Harriet owned but rarely used. The townsfolk accepted her as one of their own, and she gradually began to feel less like a desperate widow and more like a woman with a future. Grant called on her regularly, always respectful of her need for space, but consistent in his attention. They took Sunday walks after church, shared meals at the hotel, and occasionally rode out to Diamond Creek Ranch, where Victoria met the other cowboys and helped Eleanor Thornton with her vegetable garden. One crisp October afternoon, as they rode back to town from the ranch, Grant suggested they stop at a small creek that ran through a grove of cottonwoods, their leaves golden in the autumn light. "It's beautiful here," Victoria said as they dismounted. She inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of fallen leaves and earth. "It's my favorite spot," Grant admitted, spreading a blanket on the ground. "I come here to think sometimes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Victoria was acutely aware of Grant beside her, his presence both comforting and exciting in a way that made her feel slightly guilty. "May I ask you something?" Grant said finally, turning to face her. "Of course." "Are you happy here in Broken Ridge?" Victoria considered the question. "I am," she said truthfully. "More than I expected to be. Harriet has been like family to me and the work is satisfying. And—" She hesitated, then continued, "I've enjoyed our friendship." Grant nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about that, our friendship." Victoria's heart quickened. "Oh, Victoria, I care for you more than as a friend." He took a deep breath. "I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I would never want to rush you or dishonor his memory, but I wanted you to know my feelings." Victoria looked down at her hands, twisted in her lap. "Grant, She struggled to find the words. "I care for you too, but sometimes I feel disloyal even thinking about another man. Thomas hasn't been gone even 6 months." Grant reached out slowly and took her hand. "There's no right amount of time for grief, Victoria. But I don't believe Thomas would want you to be alone forever." Tears filled Victoria's eyes. "He wouldn't," she agreed softly. "He told me before he died that he wanted me to find happiness again." She looked up at Grant. "I just didn't expect to find it so soon or here in Broken Ridge." "Does that mean—" Victoria squeezed his hand. "It means I'd like to see where this leads, though I may need patience sometimes." Grant's smile was radiant. "I have all the patience in the world for you, Victoria Ziegler." As they rode back to town, side by side in the golden afternoon light, Victoria felt a weight lifting from her heart. She would always love Thomas, but perhaps there was room in her life for new love as well. The winter of 1875-76 was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold that reminded Victoria all too painfully of the winter that had claimed Thomas. But unlike before, she was not alone in a drafty farmhouse struggling to make ends meet. Her cottage was snug, her position at the store secure, and Grant was a constant presence, checking her woodpile, bringing extra blankets and escorting her through the snow-filled streets. By Christmas, their courtship was the talk of Broken Ridge, though most approved. Harriet, in particular, was delighted, having considered herself something of a matchmaker from the beginning. "I knew at the moment he gave you those boots," she told Victoria as they decorated the store for the holiday. "A man doesn't give away his only pair of boots to just anyone." Victoria smiled, remembering. "I still have them," she admitted. "I keep them as a reminder of that day." "A good reminder," Harriet nodded approvingly. "So, has he proposed yet?" Victoria nearly dropped the glass ornament she was hanging. "Harriet, it's much too soon for that." "Nonsense. That man is in love with you, plain as day. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you feel the same." Victoria couldn't deny it. Over the past months, her feelings for Grant had deepened into something she had never expected to feel again. His steady presence, his quiet strength, and his unwavering support had become essential to her happiness. "Even if that's true," she said carefully, "I'm not sure I'm ready for marriage again." Harriet's expression softened. "My dear, none of us is ever truly ready for the important things in life. We just do our best when they come along." The Thorntons hosted a Christmas gathering at Diamond Creek Ranch, inviting not just the ranch hands but many townsfolk as well. The main house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a huge tree stood in the corner of the parlor, adorned with candles and ornaments. Victoria wore her best dress, a deep green wool that Grant had complimented her on previously. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, and she wore a small cameo pendant that had belonged to her mother. Grant met her at the door, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. The evening was filled with music, laughter, and good food. Victoria found herself enjoying the celebration more than she had expected, dancing with Grant and chatting with friends both old and new. After dinner, Samuel Thornton raised a toast to the prosperity of the ranch and the town, and then, to Victoria's surprise, to new beginnings and the promise of love. As the party continued, Grant drew Victoria away from the crowd, leading her to a small study off the main hall. "I wanted a moment alone with you," he explained, closing the door partway. Victoria smiled up at him. "It's been a wonderful evening." "It has." Grant seemed unusually nervous, running a hand through his hair. "Victoria, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart began to race. "Yes." "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You came to Broken Ridge with nothing, not even shoes on your feet, but you've brought so much to this town to me." He took her hands in his. "I know it hasn't been a year since Thomas passed, and if you need more time, I understand. But I can't imagine my life without you in it." Grant released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Victoria's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Victoria Ziegler," Grant said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Victoria's eyes. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had shared and the dreams that had died with him. And then she thought of the long journey that had brought her to Broken Ridge, to this moment, to this man who had first given her his boots and now offered his name. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Grant, I will marry you." His face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Grant pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a tender kiss that promised a lifetime of love and protection. When they returned to the party, hand in hand, their happiness was so evident that the announcement of their engagement was almost unnecessary. Eleanor Thornton was the first to notice the ring, squealing with delight and hugging Victoria tightly. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "Samuel, look." "Grant has proposed." Samuel shook Grant's hand firmly. "Couldn't have picked a better woman, son. Congratulations to you both." Harriet wiped tears from her eyes as she embraced Victoria. "My dear girl, nothing could make me happier." The celebration took on a new dimension as toasts were made to the engaged couple. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection and good wishes, but Grant remained by her side, his hand warm and steady on hers. Later, as they stood on the porch watching snow begin to fall, Grant wrapped his arm around Victoria's shoulders. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Victoria leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body. "More than I ever thought possible again," she answered honestly. "When I walked into Broken Ridge last summer, I had nothing but grief and uncertainty. Now I have a home, work I enjoy, friends who care about me, and you." She looked up at him, her heart full. "Especially you." Grant brushed a snowflake from her cheek. "I think I fell in love with you that first day when you refused to complain despite your bleeding feet. You were so brave, so determined." "I was desperate," Victoria corrected with a small laugh. "No, you were strong, you still are." He kissed her gently. "And I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to walk barefoot again, literally or figuratively." Victoria and Grant were married on a bright spring day in April 1876, almost exactly 10 months after she had walked into Broken Ridge. The ceremony was held in the same church where they had first attended service together, now decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress that Alina and Harriet had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. In her bouquet, she carried a sprig of sage from Thomas's grave, a private acknowledgement of the past that had brought her to this new beginning. Grant waited for her at the altar, his expression one of wonder and love as she walked toward him on Samuel Thornton's arm. The older man had offered to give her away, an honor Victoria had accepted with tearful gratitude. "Who gives this woman to be married?" the minister asked. "I do," Samuel replied, placing Victoria's hand in Grant's, "with the blessing of all who love her." The vows were simple but heartfelt. Victoria's voice trembled slightly as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Grant for all the days of her life. Grant's voice was steady and clear, his gray eyes never leaving hers as he made the same promises in return. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grant kissed her with such tenderness that Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. The congregation erupted in applause as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Grant Irwin. The celebration afterward was held at Diamond Creek Ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard beneath flowering apple trees. There was music and dancing, a feast prepared by the women of the town, and enough cake to feed twice their number. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the land, Grant led Victoria away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the garden. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Victoria smiled. "You've already given me so much." Grant shook his head. "This is different." He pulled out a small wooden box and placed it in her hands. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a pair of miniature boots, carved from dark wood and polished to a high shine. "They're beautiful," Victoria said, touching one gently, "but I don't understand." "They're a reminder," Grant explained, "of how we met. I had them made to commemorate this day and the journey that brought us together." He took her hands in his. "Those boots I gave you that day, they were just leather and stitching, but what they represented was the beginning of us." Victoria's heart swelled with love. "I'll treasure them always." "There's one more thing," Grant said, suddenly looking nervous again. "I bought the old Jensen place." Victoria blinked in surprise. The Jensen farm was a small but well-maintained property on the outskirts of town, with a cozy house and several acres of good land. "You did?" "When?" "Last month. I wanted it to be a surprise." Grant squeezed her hands. "I know we talked about living at the ranch, but I thought you might prefer a place of our own, close enough to town for you to continue working with Harriet if you wish, but with enough land for us to raise horses, maybe grow some crops." "And children?" Victoria asked softly. Grant's face lit up. "Especially children, as many as you want." Victoria reached up to touch his face, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "It sounds perfect, a real home." "Our home," Grant agreed, pulling her close, "and a new beginning." As they rejoined the celebration, Victoria thought about the long, painful journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief and loss that had forced her to leave everything behind, walking barefoot into an uncertain future. And the extraordinary man who had given her not just his boots, but his heart and his name. Life had not given her what she wanted, as she had told Grant that day by the creek. It had given her something she needed instead, a second chance at love and the courage to take it. That night, as she and Grant drove toward their new home in a wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by their friends, Victoria looked up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Thank you," she whispered, to whom she wasn't quite sure, perhaps to Thomas, for loving her and wanting her happiness. Perhaps to whatever force had guided her steps to Broken Ridge, or perhaps simply to life itself, for its unexpected gifts and second chances. Grant's arm tightened around her. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Irwin?" Victoria smiled at her new name, leaning into his embrace. "About journeys, and how sometimes the most difficult ones lead us exactly where we need to be." Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. "Welcome home, Victoria." And as their wagon approached the lamplight glowing in the windows of their new house, Victoria knew that she had indeed found her way home, not just to a place, but to a love that would carry her through whatever the future might bring.